Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, an interdisciplinary initiative that explores the constellation of hard problems and issues from science to health, food, the humanities, economics, law, space, ethics, etc. that we face as our species continues the transition to a spacefaring civilization. This is Episode 11, Space and Interplanetary Law, Present and Future. Our guests today include James E. Dunstan. Jim Dunstan is celebrating his 40th year as an outer space lawyer. He's the founder of the Mobius Group PLLC and serves as General Counsel at the think tank Tech Freedom. Jim has spent his career representing smaller new space companies, those dedicated to creating a fully functioning economic system in outer space. And Kenneth R. Heumann. Ken Heumann has served as a NASA attorney for a major part of his career. He also served as a NASA Chief Counsel, as an executive with the International Space Station program, and as a NASA Associate Center Director. He is currently the Director of Legal Operations at NASA headquarters. Our moderator is Chris Kimmel. Chris Kimmel is the lead at Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of Space Tango. Prior to this, he organized and led a variety of entrepreneurial ventures.
Hello, my name is Chris Kimmel, and I am the co-founder of Space Tango, a commercial space company which does biological, primarily biomedical and novel materials, designing and manufacturing in space, primarily for applications on Earth, but also now doing some things looking at the Artemis program and also looking at things for the Artemis program that might come to pass, and also for deep space, et cetera, and some of the technology that might be used. Also the founder of Humanity in Deep Space, which is the company, a nonprofit company, most recently, in fact, that we've started looking at some of the issues that are involved in humans, our species, transitioning to deep space, and how we're going to do that. Not just the technology issues, but some of the more other complicated issues that we deal with as humans, issues of ethics, physiology, psychology. Are we really equipped for deep space? Are we going to deal with this on a number of different levels? And so Humanity in Deep Space is really this global conversation that we're trying to create around some of these issues that deal with humanity in deep space. So that's who the sponsor is of this particular event, and a range of sponsors. For those who are interested, humanityindeepspace.com. You can go to that website. We do a series of free webcasts on various issues. We've already done 10, and we've got actually one coming up on May 10th called the Interplanetary Kitchen. That's going to be talking about food in deep space and how we're going to actually deal with some of the really hard problems regarding the philosophy and psychology and physiology of food for humans. And so hopefully you can go online and check it out, and we welcome your comments and considerations. Very excited here today to also be bringing to you a really interesting, important conversation on space and interplanetary law as we get closer and closer and closer to moving out of low Earth orbit and putting humans and commercial operations into deeper space, in low Earth orbit, as well as the moon, and ultimately onto Mars. There are lots of interesting new issues that are arising that we have to really struggle with on a legal sense. We already are a spacefaring civilization. As you know, we've been in space since the 60s. We've been to the moon. We've had people living and working in space for over a decade with space station and the shuttle. We have robots on Mars, which are simply an extension of us as humans. So this isn't science fiction. These are things that are happening today as we go about our day-to-day work. Things of a commercial nature, ethical nature, also defense nature, et cetera, that are taking place. So the law of governance becomes a really key issue here. So we have two really great panelists, one with me live and one via Zoom. Ken Heumann, I'm going to ask both of them to say a few words about themselves, and Jim Dunstan, Jim is in Virginia, and he wasn't able to join us live, so he's here via Zoom. So let me start out by asking each of you to start with Ken. Ken, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this August panel. I just want to say that Chris is a great innovator in space himself and has founded several companies here in Kentucky, which is kind of off the beaten track in terms of the normal pathways for space companies. And Jim is one of the foremost space lawyers in the world, and so I'm certainly honored to be here. And I got to say that the opinions I express are not necessarily those of NASA. They're only my own, even though I work for NASA. I just can't imagine how we're going to cover this subject in an hour, because there's like so much to talk about, and I'm really interested in hearing questions from the audience and from the people that are listening. So,
Yep. Thank you. Jim?
Great. Thanks for inviting me and having me back, Chris. I wish I could be there live, but with modern technology, I guess we can do it. Do it via Zoom. So quickly about me, I'm in my 40th year of practicing law. I'm actually a commercial space lawyer. So by that, I mean I represent clients before a whole host of agencies, everything from the FCC for frequencies, NASA to do work for them, NOAA for remote sensing, FAA, AST for launches, so the whole panoply of sort of federal agencies. So I really consider myself to be a commercial space lawyer, and I've had a wonderful and great career, but I'm still going strong and hope another couple decades worth ahead of me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you. And I've known Jim for a long time, actually, probably 15 years ago, or 10 or 15 years, I actually invited Jim. We held a workshop on space mining, and Jim was the resident expert we brought in. So we're gonna be talking for a while, and then we'll take questions. But I want to start with just kind of an opening salvo, opening question for both of you in terms of space law right now, and I'll prompt you as we go along with different things. Kind of where are we now? I mean, kind of what is the state of space law globally and in the United States right now? Jim, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so in terms of where we are, we have a treaty regime. So fundamentally, space law is international law because space doesn't belong to anyone. And that was established with Sputnik. And the idea that if a satellite is going over your country, you can't shoot it down because that's not your airspace. And that was established all the way back in 1959. But we have a treaty regime that dates from the 60s and early 70s. And then we have, in the United States at least, some domestic legislation. And as I mentioned in sort of my intro, and then a whole panoply of agencies in the United States that to a greater or lesser extent regulates space activities. So we've got a mature set of space laws. But what's interesting and different now is we're seeing a real, with SpaceX and other players, we're seeing a real entrance of more commercial space, and that raises a whole host of issues. It's one thing to have nations, doing activities in space, and so they can consult with each other on a diplomatic, and that's really how the international regime was set up. But now we got a lot of commercial entities out there, and that really makes it another level of complexity in trying to figure out how to regulate their activities in outer space.
Ken?
Well, first of all, I kind of think of the Outer Space Treaty, which goes back to 1967, as kind of the Magna Carta of space law, in the sense that it was the first international legal regime that was established. And it was established at a time quite different from now, when there wasn't as much space activity and all the different types of activities. And certainly I feel like, to the extent that the space era is like 6 decades old, that we're on the cusp of something really big. I can see a thriving cislunar economy, within a decade or two, and cislunar, of course, being the area between the moon and Earth. And NASA has all kinds of plans. Artemis 2 is supposed to take place before the end of next year, and then not long after that, Artemis 3, where we'll actually land boots on the moon. And there's so many, interesting questions about where we'll land and about the commercial activities that Jim referred to that are just like soaring in terms of their magnitude and value.
Can we talk, let me go back, let me talk a little bit about some people may not be that familiar with this Outer Space Treaty of 1967. What are some of the key components of that? course, that was signed, interestingly, I mean, before we had humans on the moon, so it's a bit dated, but I know that's been kind of the guiding principle for a while. So what are some of the key components of that we should be concerned about?
Well, I don't know what you'd be concerned about, but I mean, it states...
Well, interested in most
it states things in very broad principles and terms, which has made it susceptible to interpretation, and there's been a lot of debate. For instance, there was another treaty, the Moon Treaty, whereas the Outer Space Treaty has been adopted by like 120 countries, the Moon Treaty was only adopted by 18, mostly because it was viewed as prohibiting appropriation of celestial or outer space resources in a way that might inhibit business. Whereas the Outer Space Treaty does say that space is free for exploration and use. And NASA has recently been attempting to form an international coalition going forth with the Artemis program, where we've developed these things called the Artemis Accords, which are supposed to be consistent with the Outer Space Treaty. But a lot of people view them with suspicion, a lot of other countries and commentators, that it's kind of, you know, us pushing American businesses, as the U.S. is currently, you know, one of the foremost leaders in space.
Jim, what's your insight here?
I think the key component of really the entire treaty regime, but starting with the Outer Space Treaty, is that space is free, it's open, and no one can claim it. And so that's really bedrock law, international law, is that nobody can go to Mars and claim Mars as a whole. But even more than that, you can't land on the South Pole of the Moon and claim all of that area at the South Pole of the Moon as your property. And so, but that's different than, and as Ken was talking about the Moon Treaty, what is allowable, I believe, under international law, and the United States has recognized it in 2015 domestic law, that if you extract materials from the moon or from an asteroid, you can't actually own that. And so it's a real interesting sort of property rights dichotomy, but you can't own all of the celestial object, but if you extract stuff out of it, that you can own that. And that's consistent with the 67 Outer Space Treaty, but inconsistent with the 79 Moon Treaty, which is why most of us really feel that's failed international law.
Who are some of the, how many countries signed the 1967 treaty?
Yeah, I think Ken, you referred to it's 118, 120. Basically, anybody who's ever done anything in space has signed on to that one.
Okay, and what about the lunar treaty, most recent?
Yeah, it's 18, 17.
Yeah, what is it?
The U.S. has not signed the Moon Treaty.
Okay, that's interesting. And,
Yes.
and what was the reasoning behind that?
Well, just because of what I said, where the Moon Treaty was viewed as more restrictive in terms of inhibiting business activities. And
okay, I'm going to come back.
Call for establishing an actual international entity to control resource extraction from space, and the United States and the Soviet Union, who initially proposed it, said no, that's a step too far. We're not going to sign it. So the United States, Russia, Soviet Union, China, none of the major space players have signed the Moon Treaty.
Okay, I want to come back.
Incidentally, you know, like in 1967, when we signed the Outer Space Treaty, we were in the thick of the moon race, and it wasn't clear who was going to get there first. So both sides were kind of willing to hedge their bets and sign to the Outer Space Treaty to inhibit the other side from making any claim of national sovereignty.
Interesting. So if I'm a
And just to follow up on one point Jim made, you know, we also have established some precedent to the extent the Apollo astronauts brought back moon rocks, and I don't think anybody challenges that we own those moon rocks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yet. Nobody challenged it yet. I want to go back and talk about some things of more kind of immediate, I think, issues that we deal with. So there's a lot of companies now in the commercial side of space. I think the major markets still remain are remote sensing, communications, satellites, things of that nature. But there's a lot of other activity going on with people looking at designing and developing novel materials, people working on pharmaceuticals in space, other kinds of biomedical applications. So what's the current? If I'm a company and I'm out there and I'm spending a lot of money doing that, what's the status of being able to say patent a material, or perhaps more importantly, an organism, we'll say, or a particular construction of a drug or a pharmaceutical in space, and what kind of protection can you actually get right now from something perhaps that was developed, invented, that can't exist, basically can't be designed, or actually cannot be manufactured in 1G on Earth?
Yeah, so that's a great example of where Congress has actually extended U.S. law into space. There are just a few narrow areas where they have, but they passed amendments to the patent law that said that any invention which is patented on a U.S. space object, which has its own definition under international law, is governed by U.S. patent law. So if I develop something in the United States module on ISS, U.S. patent law applies to it, and I can file a patent in the United States, and I can exclude others from using that invention in the United States. So that's pretty clear, and that's one that it took Congress a while. I think it was 1990 or so before Congress passed that. But we got real clarity on that. There are a lot of other issues that are much more ambiguous as to whether or not U.S. law applies in outer space. But patents, I think we got it pretty clear.
What are some of the other issues that you're alluding to?
Issues are, for example, Congress has stated that the commander of a U.S. outpost in space has authority, including the power to use force, to make sure that peace is, it prevails. And so, they literally, I remember when I was a young pup attending Hill hearings, and they were talking about, are you going to issue the commander of the shuttle a gun? And the answer was, yeah, well, if we think we need it, we will. So under U.S. law, on U.S. Establishments in space, the commander has supreme authority and has the ability to enforce U.S. laws. And there are a few others like that, but by and large, we're still in kind of an ambiguous zone as to what U.S. laws apply in outer space.
Okay. Ken, any thoughts?
And Jim's right, but you can break down almost anything you say into another level of complexity where there's actually a Russian segment on the space station, and we envision commercial space stations. NASA has recently entered into 3 agreements with companies that are going to develop commercial space stations in the years to come. And then there's the question, if you have a lunar base, it's quite easy to envision that there'll be things invented, if you establish a base near Shackleton Crater and you want to set up refractors on the crater's rim to melt ice at the bottom of the crater, and you have devices taking that back to some sort of central facility that's going to perform electrophoresis and separate it into hydrogen and oxygen. Maybe that equipment's going to operate differently in low gravity of the moon, and maybe you'll end up inventing things in the moon, and how will that apply?
Yeah. So how would given what Ken just said, do you think the current U.S. law on this would extend to something like that on the moon?
Yeah, I do. I think it's pretty clear, because getting back to what's a space object, and that's under, that brings up a different treaty, the Registration Convention. So if I register my moon base as a United States object, then under the Registration Convention, then then the patent law would apply similarly there. On the moon base, anything invented on that would be considered to be invented in the United States, and United States patent law would apply. So I think we're going to see that as a model, frankly, for a lot of other things. We talked previously offline about, what about Food and Drug? The Food and Drug Administration, how are they going to deal with new drugs invented?
Right.
But I think that patent model is pretty clean. And I know we've got a Congress right now that's really interested in these types of issues, and we may see some legislation. I mean, hard to think about that this Congress can do anything these days. But space traditionally has been very bipartisan and nonpartisan. And so there is real interest in trying to look at this overarching issue of how we apply United States law and when we apply United States law in outer space. And that again gets back to all the commercial activity. There's so much going on that the lawmakers are trying to not let the inventors get ahead of the lawmakers. Not an easy task, but they're really interested in it right now.
Yeah, you brought up something that I think is oftentimes overlooked and quite interesting and quite complex, and that is a lot of biomedical things that are being looked at in space. And you oftentimes read articles about somebody who's working with, brain organoids or other kinds of things, and be saying, well, why are you doing this? Well, maybe we'd be growing livers in space in 15 years, 20 years. Of course, the question becomes, aside from everything, the complexity there is, we have really no idea how we would get FDA approval for some of those kinds of things. And I often think that that's obviously a big issue, is how we're going to deal with. Nobody's putting anything in anybody's body until we figure that out. Any thoughts on that, Ken?
And yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities in terms of, to what extent do we want to it's not really clear that humans can survive a trip to Mars and back, given the radiation in that environment. And perhaps it'll be possible to, by that time, genetically modify people or perform preemptive surgeries, which would prevent certain kinds of medical crises. But, I think one thing I wanted to mention also, in reaction to what Jim was talking about also, is that in terms of the application of U.S. law, and, the U.S. is currently the leader in terms of plans to explore Mars, but there is a growing international community. Every year there are more and more countries that are participating in space programs, and the Chinese now have a very active program and are aligning with other countries. And there is, in effect, kind of a race in effect now to get to the most valuable areas on the moon, such as Shackleton Crater, and Artemis 3 plans to land near the South Pole where Shackleton Crater is. But so it's not just U.S. law, but there's going to be international law. And a matter of fact, the United Nations has started an endeavor called Building Blocks under their Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And that has a 5-year plan to produce a new document that could, theoretically create a new kind of legal regime as well that could affect all this.
Mm-hmm. So let me, so I want to go back a little bit quickly a little bit to space mining. Space mining's been one of the things that's been talked about for a number of years. There have been a number of companies who were created in the past decade to do that. I think many of them have gone away for various reasons, part of which because I think the market's not very close on that. But Jim, do you foresee, realistically, do you foresee that being relatively, when I say near term, I talk about near term in space, doesn't mean 4 or 5 years, but not 1,000 years, a realistic commercial operation?
Yeah, no, I actually do. I think if you look at, notwithstanding how much we brought down the cost of launch, from the Earth that SpaceX and others have done, it's still expensive, to launch stuff. And if you look at any sort of roadmap to a cislunar development of bringing large number of peoples, it's got to involve using a lot of in situ the natural resources that are in space. You just can't lug up all the water from Earth. It's just too heavy. It's just too expensive to do. And so if you look at any of the any of these, like I said, roadmaps, any of these great visionary writings, I go back to, I knew, Gerard K. O'Neill at Princeton, and his work on the high frontier and things like that. They all talk about bootstrapping natural resources, and so those who can get there and start making use of those resources are going to be the ones that are going to be ahead of the game here, as instead of having to lug everything up from the deep gravity well of Earth. So yeah, I think there are certainly some of the early, as you say, some of the early adopters in this area have failed, but that's just because they couldn't close their business case in time. That's always the big problem with commercial space in new areas, is the time to get your return on investment. Because in a telecom, in a remote sensing, and a lot of things in space, you can turn it around and you can make a profit in 5 years. But if you're talking, about doing space resources, about mining, that's a decade, that's 2 decades. Not very many, VCs are willing to plop down the money and say, I'll come knock on your door in 20 years and see how you're doing.
Yeah, what about the issue of bringing materials back to Earth?
I think that's unlikely. I think Jim's right that it's the main purpose of space mining initially is going to be in situ resource utilization, which will be absolutely necessary, particularly the further you get away from Earth. But I've read various commentators who claim that it's just about impossible to cover the cost of launching something from Earth and getting it back to Earth. Even if you found an asteroid of platinum, these people claim that it's pretty hard to justify the economics of bringing it back to Earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, isn't there also often, and I'm not an expert in this, but we talk about space mining and bringing materials back, and say, platinum or some of these, exotic materials that are very, very important and very valuable. It's also an issue of supply and demand. Obviously, if you bring back suddenly, if something's not a scarce resource anymore, obviously the price paradigm is going to be different.
You can easily crash the market. You'd be a victim of your own success. That's right. But there are some things. Some of the precious metals. And by the way, I always like to tell people, let's remember when we're talking about precious metal mining, especially, we're already mining asteroids. There happen to be the asteroids that have hit the Earth and imbued the Earth's near surface with a lot of these precious metals, most of which came from space, not from the natural formation of the Earth. But yeah, there are some things, particularly, potentially, some fusion, fuel reactor. There's talk about doing some mining for getting the exotic fuels that we might use in fusion. That could be worth it to bring back down. But Ken's absolutely right that the vast majority of the mining is going to be used to support the overall infrastructure, to build things, to extract water from the moon for propellant and for living. So it's all, most of it, 99% of it's going to stay, off the Earth's surface. But people are still going to make money off it.
Yeah, Jim's got a point. And to the extent that there's a way to mine helium-3 and get it back to Earth, no matter how expensive that might be, given the energy crisis and the alternatives here on Earth, that might be something that would be justifiable.
Yeah, I just for everybody who's watching here and perhaps as we put this on the web, just talk a little bit, because I've been involved in thinking about this and I've heard about it forever, but the whole issue of helium-3, which is kind of interesting, and I've heard both sides of the story in terms of people's thinking, but the whole issue of, the story behind helium-3 and its abundance on the moon and why we were concerned about it.
Well, they've already made a movie about it, so I mean, it's like practically happened.
What was that movie?
It was a movie where there was a space mining operation. It was like a one-person crew. I forget the name of it, but the guy was like working in solitude on the moon surface. You don't remember that movie?
I think I do remember.
Was it called The Moon?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
It's just called The Moon.
Yeah, I think I do remember. He kind of went crazy, didn't he?
Exactly. I think he started talking to himself.
Yeah, which is not unusual. Yeah, because I've heard both sides. I mean, helium-3, when I first started getting interested in space, 15 years ago or so, 18 years ago, that was a big topic of conversation.
Yeah, of course, the problem is, with fusion up until very recently.
Right.
Fusion was always, 1 decade away, but it had always been 1 decade away for the last 7 decades. We never got closer to closing that gap. However, some recent advances appear that we may have closed. We may actually be, into that decade out, which is really encouraging and may sort of jumpstart again this idea of helium-3 mining. And but you got to say, I mean, helium-3 is incredibly rare on Earth. It's still very rare on the moon. I mean, you have to gobble up an awful lot of regolith, to get it. Actually, the best place I've heard to get helium-3 in the solar system is you go scoop it out of Jupiter's atmosphere and fly it back, that way, because it's actually fairly abundant in the Jupiter atmosphere. But people are thinking about this, and people are already trying to figure out how to make that business case close.
Yeah, I want to circle back, as I said, back to this issue. In my mind, isn't very straightforward. And this whole issue of what we talked about earlier, dealing with issues of governance, which are going to be a big issue. Can someone own the moon? Can someone own Mars? Elon Musk has already commented. I've heard him comment that he doesn't think there are many rules on Mars that would apply to a commercial company like his.
Well, under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, it applies equally to U.S. companies. So there's no question that he would be under the jurisdiction and subject to regulation by U.S. under the Outer Space Treaty.
But then the question, and again, there's no right answer here, but who's going to enforce that?
Good question.
I mean, you can't invade other countries either, but we're going through obviously we've gone through the history of the human condition. We do that all the time. And I think that's one of the, I used to think, I was one of the people, I think early on when they created the Space Force, was kind of cynical about that. But the more I've thought about it, the more I realized, unfortunately, that is going to be a big issue, the potential militarization of space. And a lot of it's going to be, as it's always been, ordering resources and those kinds of things. And, so who's
we've got this huge cloud of space debris around us in low Earth orbit, and some good percentage of it was created by the testing of anti-satellite weapons, including those by the U.S. and Russia, and I think India might have done it, in addition to China.
Yeah. I've always wondered about this. What would happen if a huge part, either space debris or some sort of object or rocket or something that malfunctioned and came and actually landed on Earth and killed people? I mean, what's the liability around that?
Well,
so that's the easy one, because we actually have a bifurcated legal system under the liability convention right after the Outer Space Treaty. And so for objects that do damage on the surface of the Earth or in the air, it's a strict liability. It's an absolute liability. So if my rocket body comes down and lands on your cow and kills it, I as a nation am obligated to pay that, regardless of whether or not it was my fault. So that's the easy one. The tougher one, and the one that we're dealing with. Go ahead, Ken.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt, Jim, but there was a case where a Russian surveillance satellite that was nuclear powered came down and hit Canada and contaminated part of where it hit with radioactive material. And Canada ended up making a claim. Was it the Soviet Union? I guess it was before. As I remember, the Russians ended up paying like about 50 cents on a dollar, but they did pay something.
That was the Cosmos 954 accident in 1979. And initially, the Soviet Union tried to disclaim liability. Then there was a lot of diplomatic, state-to-state negotiation, and then it just came down to the money. How much were they going to pay? And as Ken said, it's estimated they probably paid about 50% of the cleanup costs of it. But that's the only one we got. But at least, that's pretty straightforward. The tougher question is, what happens if my satellite hits your satellite in orbit? And there, we're literally sort of traditional, who ran the red light, car accident. it's a negligence regime. It's who's at fault. That's a really difficult thing to administer. So we've had a couple of collisions in space where both countries have sort of decided to not press the issue. Especially there was the Cosmos Iridium case, about a decade ago, and essentially both entities said, well, it was just an accident. It was an act of God. There was no negligence involved. And so that's going to be the real sort of, pun intended, high watermark is when one of those cases people try to litigate who's at fault.
That's interesting because those probably not familiar with actually the first iteration of Space Tango, before it was Space Tango, was Kentucky Space, which was a nonprofit company that was around for actually 10, 12 years before we transitioned to a for-profit Space Tango in 2015 or so. We started out by flying CubeSat satellites. And that was what the company was going to do. We were going to fly CubeSats, and we used to get NORAD would track all these. And I have to also say that in the early days of creating these companies, those of us who were involved in creating them knew nothing what we were doing. It was like a bunch of kids getting out in the backyard and saying, let's put up a tree house and we'll see what happens. And we started after we were up, we had settled up, we started getting notices from NORAD on near misses. And we're like, holy crap, that doesn't sound good, And so there was a lot of things that we even, we didn't expect, but those are all tracked, and we would get near miss, sometimes get near miss to let us know that one of our satellites came very close to whatever very close is into space. So it's there's a lot of unclear issues out there. But let me come back to before we open up for questions here. Again, this is a tough one, but so it's all nice that we have treaties, and I know there's no right answer here, and there is no answer, but it's all nice that we have treaties, but if the United States or the Chinese or the Russians or a private company goes to another planet and says, we don't believe the treaty applies here, and we own this part of it, how are we as a species going to try to, if it's even remotely possible, going to deal? I'm not looking for an answer, but I mean, to me, that seems like that's one of those existential questions that we've got to get realistic about. Is how are we going as a species to really start to deal with this? And again, we're already behind the curve because we're already, we've got the United States has had robots on Mars for how long, Ken?
Decades.
Those are simply extensions of us as humans. I mean, and so we already have extensions on Mars. We've been to the moon. There are now, companies talking about going back. I know it's kind of a philosophical question, but I think it's an important.
I mean, my take on this is everybody's worried about China, and they should be. They are very aggressive. There was just a report released this week about China essentially saying they're going to have boots on the ground on the South Pole of the moon by the end of the decade. So do the math. That's 7 years out. They're talking about having humans back down there, and that's going to be really the flashpoint on it. Now we're assuming, I think, some people are saying that China may pull out of the outer space treaty. I don't think they'll do that. I think there are too many other negative repercussions that can happen. But what I think you are going to see them do is try to use Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty that says that your activities can't interfere with the rights and uses of others, and try to then use that, what are known as exclusionary zones. And the Artemis Accords, try to put a little bit more definition into that. But here's the flashpoint. We talked about Shackleton Crater on the South Pole. Why is it important? Because we think there's a large amount of water down at the base of that. So it turns out, according to the maps, which aren't particularly great, there's really only one good way to get down into Shackleton Crater. It's kind of like an on-ramp into that crater. What if China lands close to that on-ramp and claims an exclusionary zone such that nobody else can get down into Shackleton from there? That's going to be, I think, the real practical issue here, and how we deal with it. Traditionally, going back to when we just came out of the trees and had sticks and bones, we beat each other up and killed each other over stuff like that. The question is, can we avoid it this time around and come to some sort of resolution that doesn't lead to a localized or a wider war?
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, but in addition to the probable water resources at the bottom of the crater, there are peaks along the rim which are in almost continuous sunlight, which would be just a wonderful place to use solar radiation to produce power. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are obviously highly advantageous places to be in the moon. And, we don't even know, there may be volcanic tunnels on the moon, which would be great initial habitats, to protect you from radiation.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna say this, but I'm not even gonna get into this, is, what happens if our species, whoever it is, goes to Mars, dig down 100 meters and finds life. Even primitive, multicellular, one-cell life. Let's not even go what happens, what that flashpoint, all the issues that it raises. It's interesting. I had one of the webcasts we did with Humanity in Deep Space. We had 3 former naval officers, one which was a former captain of a nuclear attack sub, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to talk to them about the analogs between, particularly a submarine going underwater for 3 months, and the physiological and psychological issues that they dealt with when you went there, did that, and just some of the other issues. And there was 2 things that really were interesting about this. When I asked Admiral Thomas, who was the naval, the submarine captain, they go underwater for 3 months, they don't come up. One was, what is the, after you've done all your preliminary, training and of your crew, et cetera, what's the biggest, most important thing to keeping, order on the ship other than the, military? He said it's very easy, it's food. And food is one of the big things that I think is not just me, but others, is not really, I think that's one of the things we think we're going to figure out. But when you look at a one-way trip to Mars being 5.5 to 6 months, if you say you circumnavigate for 6 months and then you come back, you're talking 2.5 year mission. And people, no matter, I think it's completely unrealistic to think that people are going to eat, granola for 2.5 years. I don't care how much nutritional value. And then the other thing was, we talked about some of the military things. He said, from a military standpoint, of course, he said the ultimate high ground is space. So I'm going to leave it there and ask and turn it over and see if we have any questions that people like to, on anything that these experts have to say. Yes, sir.
I was so interested in what you sort of implied earlier about a role that the Space Force might have to play as serving as some kind of arbiter or enforcer of international law. Is that really the role you see them playing moving forward? And I mean, how might that affect their ability to engage with commercial enterprise in the same way that NASA has throughout its history?
Yeah, I really don't know. I've become somewhat of a cynic on this topic. I mean, I'm really concerned given the history of the human race. I mean, I look back and I don't ever see a time, when, if you look at the, explorers in the past, I mean, they were primarily commercial in nature, and when they came upon things they didn't like, they just took them, and there was, so I don't know. I want to believe that we're going to figure a way out to this, but I don't know what it is, and I just, I just don't know. And I think that the example on the Shackleford is a perfect example. If that's of high value and there's one way in, and whoever it is, gets in there and says, we own this, and there's only one way in and one way out. I mean, it's nice for us to say, there's a treaty or something, but to my thinking, the only reason ultimately in the history of the human race people have abided by treaties is because somebody had a bigger gun. So I don't know, but I'm concerned about that.
Well, I'm sure China's thinking the same thing about us, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Any other?
Yeah, so I'd say 2 things. I think the Space Force is going to have a critical role in Earth orbit management and Earth orbit sort of policing. To have a Space Force that can bring to public attention when a foreign country takes a satellite and sidles up next to one of ours. There are things that they can play a role both in space situational awareness and defense of our assets up there. And I think they will play that vital role, and I think they'll be really effective at doing it. But when you really start talking about the other celestial bodies, boots on the ground on the moon or on Mars, that one is going to become much tougher to do. Because, are we going to commit ourselves, for example, to put, boots on the ground on the moon? The problem there, of course, is according to the Outer Space Treaty, we've all agreed not to establish military bases on any of the celestial bodies. And so how do we do that? How does the Space Force operate in space without having bases? And there's a long debate about what that clause, what is a base, under the 67 Outer Space Treaty that we're going to have to come about, because you can't, at some point, you can't do it with a remote sensing, you can't do it with hardware. You're going to have boots on the ground. And that's when the rubber really is going to hit the road.
Yeah, question?
So in the future, do you kind of see it taking the path of a segmentation of sovereignty, of like Mars having its own, the moon having its own, or do you see it being kind of a unified force of nations here not wanting to give up that power to other planetary systems and kind of making it to where it's a broader stroke that applies to all?
Yeah, great question. Ken?
I'm looking forward to the Federation,
Yeah, right.
But I do think that, it's likely that even U.S. exploration will be multinational, that will be, part of a coalition of nations that, explore space. And I can't see, the U.S. going to Mars alone. And, I think that the more nations that are involved, the better the result's going to be in terms of reducing the possibility of conflict.
Jim?
For that, turn to Heinlein's, the moon is the heart's mistress, or Alan Steele's lunar descent, for sort of the near-term science fiction stories of breaking away. But the analog we have right now going is there have been many attempts to start seafaring nations, people just, building these gigantic barges and going out into the seas and declaring themselves to be free of sovereignty. And the reason none of them can ever succeed is because the taxing authority of countries on Earth are so strong that no country is going to want to give up the tax base, to allow that to happen. The same thing would happen on Mars, I think. The reason why there's going to be such a difficulty in breaking free of U.S. government or terrestrial Earth-born governments is because the tax man wants his money. And that's always going to be an impediment to breaking free.
Other questions? Yes.
The space stations that are in development right now, are they going to be classified as U.S. space objects?
Under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, absolutely.
Okay, so and they're open to customers from all over the planet. So let's say a group of entrepreneurs from Lower Slovenia rents Orbital Reef for a month.
Mm-hmm.
They have an amazing innovation, but is the U.S. going to claim intellectual property and patenting authority over that?
Right now, NASA takes the position that it wants to be on kind of the leading edge of the frontier. And, back in the early 2000s, we had this program called the Orbital Transportation System, under which we funded the development of the capability to deliver cargo to low Earth orbit. And now we have SpaceX doing that. And then, like later on, 5 or 6 years later, we had the Commercial Crew Program, which funded the capability of crew transport. And now we have at least one company, but soon to be 2 companies that are going to be capable of doing that. Similarly, the idea is that we're going to generate this capability through funding to help companies develop these stations. And they'll still operate under the legal regime and whatever contract and agreement provisions, and it's hard to say exactly how that will play out, in terms of all the various possibilities.
Yeah. Diane, you got a question?
As the two of you are working together with yourselves and other great minds of looking at laws to govern outer space and our future behavior in space, has that brought you to any new perspectives about enforcing or creating laws on Earth that might be more effective as well?
Did you get that question, Jim?
Could you repeat it? It broke up a little
The
bit.
question was, in your all's work in thinking about these issues in outer space, the ethics, the legal issues, et cetera, has thinking about that and working on that led you to any new ideas, new insights that might benefit Earth in this realm?
Yeah, I've had one real revelation over the last couple of years, and it's a combination of two different pieces that I've worked on. I did a chapter on interstellar law for an interstellar ship. What type of government should we have? And I had done a paper on this back in the 90s about I called will a Bill of Rights survive a trip to the moon? I looked at the 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, and I kind of broke all those down. But in looking at interstellar, multi-generational things, governance models, the thing that really struck me, going back to historical analogs, military bases, submarines, the Pilgrims and things like that, was the value of innovation and the value of rewarding innovation, and that if we don't preserve that going out into space, we're not going to survive as a species. If we don't have a governance model that rewards the airflow engineer to squeeze 1% more out of the air filtration system, at some point, people will die because of that lack of innovation. And so, one thing we take for granted in this country, I think, because we're so used to the Bill of Rights and our 10 core freedoms there. There's one that's in the Constitution itself. It's the patents clause. It's the fact that Congress shall grant inventors of useful items a reward for their inventions. And I think that we have to figure out, how to cultivate and to reward in space, however we choose to govern ourselves. Because, I remember a study that came out, a number of decades ago that basically said the only way you go to Mars is that you launch 3 identical ships, because you're going to have to cannibalize the other 2 to make sure that that one group survives. And if you think of that in terms of that you have to have that much redundancy in your systems, you can never get to Mars, because the throw weight, how much you have to put up there. And so we've got to figure out a way to fix things along the way, and 3D printing is a great way to think about doing that. But we really are going to have to be able to cultivate and reward innovation to survive, because space is a really harsh place.
Looking at it another way, one way I'd answer your question is that if you think back to the very beginning of the space age and the first pictures that the Apollo astronauts took of Earth, I think that had a profound, influence on our civilization, and it probably helped spawn the environmental movement, and it gave us a perspective on our fragile globe floating in the darkness and isolation of space, particularly in contrast to the barren surface of the moon. And now we're approaching 8 billion people on Earth, and we're seeing a climate crisis. But I think that there has been a good effect in terms of things like the Endangered Species Act. We haven't treated ourselves very well over the course of human history, but much less other forms of life. And I personally believe that to the extent that we are stardust, we're made up of stardust, that the universe is probably replete with life. And you know, if you look at all the extreme places on Earth, the hottest places, the coldest places, we find life. And I think it's going to be the same way as we explore space. And I hope we have a greater respect for those other forms.
Yeah, I agree. Got time for one more question, anybody? Yeah. How you doing?
This one might be a little abstract, but so a lot of early colonization efforts in a very strange way might have benefited from the mercantile kind of structure, right? Where we weren't looking at funds as much in terms of liquidity, but really in terms of exchange of raw materials and accumulation of raw materials. Do you think that we're entering into a similar time in terms of cislunar commercial activities? And if yes, do you see some interesting problems? Maybe?
Yeah, it's hard to predict. I don't think anybody in the 60s could have predicted the success of the telecommunications industry, and you know, which is now totally dependent on space. And of course, you know, we in the U.S. have developed our global positioning satellites, and now there's Galileo, the European version, and GLONASS, the Russian version, and I think there's like Indian and Chinese versions under development as well. So, you know, space is gradually spawning new industries, and you know, there's a lot of things that can be manufactured and developed in microgravity that, you know, we can't do here on the surface. And, you know, I do think there will be all kinds of new industries that are difficult to imagine at this point. You know, if you go back 100 years, you know, we were just barely fooling around with aviation. So just think, you know, now when the pace of change seems to be so much more rapid, you know, what might the world and cislunar space be like in 100 years?
Yeah, we were last night, just ironically, one of the people who was able to join us today is Kyle Kimmel, who's my nephew. He's an aerospace engineer. He happened to be in town for a day or so he wanted to come by. And we were at dinner last night, and we were playing around with ChatGPT, and I was just completely blown away. I mean, I couldn't, you know, I asked it, you know, write me a 200-page article on something, and on time dilation, and within seconds, you know, it started writing it.
Write poetry in the style of Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't, and we had to, you know, prompt it to get it down some more, and it wasn't perfect, but the idea that you know, something, and he showed me, listened to me yesterday, a song that has written, was somebody put on, says, I want a song that sounds like this, and sounds like this artist. And it was amazing. I mean, I go out and buy it, and it's, you know, it's not, you know, no human developed it. So I think you're right. I think we we always have, I think, in society, we grossly underestimate the technology that's coming. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to imagine, since it's hard to imagine and maybe impossible, it's hard to deal with it and to prepare for it when these things are, I mean, even now with ChatGPT, I mean, it's just amazing to me to think all the things that now could be developed that are basically machine generated.
Right, just last.
You talk about law, Jim, right? There's, I mean, machine, you know, can machines own things? I don't know.
Just last Tuesday, we had these landing vehicle landing in the moon that was launched by an American private company 5 months ago. And you know, who could have imagined that 100 years ago?
Yeah. So we're out of time. I'm going to ask each of you any closing thoughts. Jim, you have anything else you want to close up with?
Yeah, you know, again, Chris, I want to thank you for convening this. I think it's really important, and I think it's important right now because that last question from the audience sort of brings it full circle, and that's the fact that you know, that countries operating in space for the space age, for the 60 years of the space age, has all sort of been self-regulated, contained, planned, you know, and consequently, we haven't done all that much. We've only gone to the moon, with humans a few times. But you interject into that ecosystem the craziness of capitalism, free markets, entrepreneurs. That's where you get to ChatGPT. That's where you get to the internet. This incredible explosion of technology. And I think we are about to see that in space. And it really scares a lot of people. And it should, because I think we are going to see more development in the next decade than we've seen in the first 60 years of the space race. And it's going to come from really deep thinkers, entrepreneurs, people willing to take crazy ideas and take a lot of risk that governments heretofore haven't done. And because of that, we need to think about these issues as much as we can. But we also don't want to grip the steering wheel so hard that we stifle that innovation, because space has so many resources to be utilized for the benefit of all humankind on Earth. We should take advantage of those and let those crazy ideas develop, as long as we don't kill a lot of people in the process.
Ken?
Well, we've talked a lot about the legal regime of space, but we haven't talked much about lawyers, and I just was thinking that we're blocking the law school, and to the extent that there are lawyers that are thinking, how can I get involved in space? I see there's great opportunity in the future, and like one thing, when I remember back my experience in law school and all the 1,000 different directions my lawyer friends went in, I think there are two things that really impressed me is the role that lawyers play as problem solvers and also as peacemakers. And I think those skills are going to be really important going into the future in space.
Thanks. Let me thank Jim Dunstan. I appreciate Ken Newman for joining us today. We're out of time. This is going to be, we are going to be putting it online, so hopefully those of you who missed part of it, you got friends, will be able to share this online in the not too distant future. Again, on behalf of Humanity in Deep Space and our speakers and all of the sponsors for Humanity in Deep Space, which you can go online and see all the sponsors that are help support this effort. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. You can find all of our videos, as well as other curated content, at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode of Humanity in Deep Space was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.